everyone. My name is Salim Valimamat. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome to you all to the Africa Sessions. The main objective of the Africa Sessions series of virtual conferences, part of a global strategic platform, is to foster analytical dialogue between experts on critical and timely themes, using an online platform to bring the discussion to a wide global audience. Besides live transmissions, the conferences will be available on social networks for later viewing and may be used for production of written materials. The Africa Sessions are held monthly, and the main participants are analysts, academics, government officials, journalists, and other opinion makers. The target audience includes academics, business leaders, government officials, analysts, students, and the general public. In terms of format, the Africa Sessions offer 60 to 90 minutes online debates with experts and moderators. COVID-19 provided the incentive for this important initiative. Among other things, the pandemic exposed serious deficits in terms of strategic thinking to address global challenges. The Africa Session, and more broadly, the Global Strategic Platform, will go a longer way to help alleviate these deficits. The theme for this session is Africa after COVID-19, 3 possible scenarios, a conversation with Jakkie Cilliers. For most African countries, COVID-19 is a real reminder that the continent still faces challenges and vulnerabilities that will require deep strategic thinking and forward-leaning leadership. Jakkie Cilliers gives a valuable insight in his recent book released in March this year called Africa First, where he takes a rigorous look at the emerging futures for other African nations and the continent as a whole, and also in a recent study exploring the impact of COVID-19 in Africa, where he analyzes a scenario until 2013. In this study, he presents 3 scenarios on the potential impact of COVID-19 in Africa and compares to a pre-COVID baseline using the International Futures Forecasting Platform. The likely impacts are then examined on economic growth, per capita income, poverty, and the attainment of selected targets with the forecast. So let me speak a little bit about Jakkie Cilliers. He is the founder of former executive of the Institute for Security Studies. He currently serves as a chair of the ISS Board of Trustees and head of African Future and Innovation Program at ISS. His 2017 bestseller, Fate of the Nation, addresses South Africa's future from political, economic, and social perspectives. His most recent book, Africa First, takes a rigorous look at the emerging futures of other African nations and the continent as a whole. Jakkie has presented numerous papers at conferences and seminars and published a number of books on various matters relating to peace and security in Africa. He serves on editorial boards of African Security Review, the Southern African Journal of International Affairs, and Global Trend Analysis. To moderate this debate and this conversation with Jakkie Cilliers, we have two lecturers and academics with a very strong background about Africa. One of them is Dr. Miguel Ferreira da Silva. He's an academic, researcher, and expert in security intelligence and international affairs, particularly in the matters related to Africa. Currently, is the director of the Commission for Study and Strategy of the Governance of Sea, Energy, and Environment at Lusófona University in Lisbon. Previously, he was the senior Portuguese representative at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies in Washington. and political attaché at the Embassy of Portugal in the USA. Dr. Assis Malaquias is the other one who is going to moderate this debate. He is a professor and chair of the Department of Global Studies and Maritime Affairs at California State University. He is also associate at the Colbert Center for Maritime Policies at King's College, London. He has an extensive and distinguished career in academia and public service. Prior to joining Call Maritime, he served as Overseas Maritime Security Advisor in the Africa Bureau, U.S. Department of State. His areas of specializations include international relations, strategy, international security, and maritime security. So, to get this Africa session started, I'll ask Assis Malaquias. Please, Assis, take away for this fruitful conversation with Jakkie Cilliers.
Thank you very much, Salim, indeed. Jakkie, welcome to the Africa Sessions. Jakkie, you just co-authored a major study on the on the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on the continent. Unlike the many studies being published that address current challenges, you prefer to focus on scenarios up to the year 2030. Could you please elaborate a bit on the approach and the methodology of your study?
Thanks very much, Assis, and thank you for the honor of hosting this and for making this this all possible. So I'm going to share my screen and show a graph or two. I hope that you can see my screen. On it, you will see, hopefully, a picture, firstly, of the book that was referred to, Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution, as well as the report that you referred to on the impact of COVID in Africa. In actual fact, the final version of that report is only being released this coming Thursday, so you have a bit of a first look at what it's going to look like. So I'm going to largely, just to respond to the question that you're asking with regard to the work that we do and the methodology. So we have a partnership with the University of Denver, the Frederick S. Pardee Center for International Futures, and we use their forecasting platform, which is in a sense a global algorithm with a lot of data in it that allows you to look at past trends and where we are headed on, to understand how human, social, and environmental systems interact over time, and then allows you to shape the way we think about and address major issues facing Africa. So IFS, 186 countries, we forecast 500 variables from 1960 to 2100. And I use IFS as the basis for both the book and the forecast that we've done on COVID. And IFS has a number of subsystems within it. I'm not going to go through that, but it is a global forecasting platform that includes issues that relate to demographics, governance, and so on and so forth. So what we did with the COVID study is we framed the study by looking at the economic impact of COVID, which is the horizontal axis, and the mortality impact of COVID. And we defined three scenarios: a V-shaped economic impact using the IMF data. The IMF in October of last year brought out a forecast that we use as a kind of a pre-COVID benchmark. Then we have a U-shaped economic, and then in April and June, the IMF brought out updates of their growth, based, of course, factoring in the impact of COVID. And we use that to emulate a V-shaped economic impact, a U-shaped economic impact, and an L-shaped economic impact after the growth curve, and I'll show that in a minute. And then we also modeled the impact of social grants, as well as mortality in the scenario. So that's the origins of the three scenarios that we use for the COVID forecast that we did. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the basis on which we do our forecasts.
I believe it's Assis. Or are you going to go a little bit further, Jakkie?
What I can show you is how we thought about the impact of COVID, and that is really set out in this framing, which is really that in our view, COVID has got a health, economic, a social, and a political impact, and the one flows from the one into the other. What happens is that government action has an impact on the health, the economic, the social, and the political impact. And then we take those and we look at what is the impact. For example, the health impact means that health spending shifts. Mortality and infections have an impact also on economics. So this is how our thought process, in a sense, of thinking about the impact of COVID. But I think that's enough to just, in a sense, to frame the way in which we thought about the future of COVID.
So I take it a little bit further, if I may, because according to this study, to the COVID-19 study, the study points both to the lower mortality rate and the delayed impact of the pandemic in the continent, in Africa, which means, in the end, that the worst may still lay ahead, may still come in the coming months, weeks or months. Considering the heavy social and economic toll of the containment measures, particularly in impoverished communities, how could governments take alternative preventive measures or anticipate social and economic emergency protection?
So to go back to this framing, the problem that Africa has had is that the economic impact in Africa preceded the health impact. What happened is that China was infected, the virus spread to Europe, and it came from Europe to North America, South America, and to Africa, largely through our capital cities, flights, and so on and so forth. And the reaction globally, of course, was that countries shut down on travel, and Africans generally followed and pursued the same strategies, although we can discuss how appropriate that is or was for Africa. So in a sense, while let's say in China, where this all started, the health impact led to an economic impact, social and political impact, what happened in Africa is in actual fact that the economic impact preceded the health impact. And we can in actual fact discuss the extent of the health impact, because as we all know, mortality rates in Africa are exceptionally low, and we'll probably come to that. But the economic impact in Africa is such that it has all kinds of impacts on our ability to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, on instability, on social protest, and on levels of poverty. So if we were to look at what that looks like, I started off by saying, firstly, providing a conceptual framework. So I'm showing you a graph that shows growth rates. These are the IMF growth rates. That is the growth rate of Africa that the IMF forecast in October of last year. That is our V-shaped forecast of economic growth rates. That is our U-shaped economic growth forecast, and that is our L-shaped economic growth forecast for Africa out till 2030. And this is the growth rate for the world except Africa, or the rest of the world. To give you an idea, the pre-COVID scenario was that Africa would grow at 2.6% this year and would have an average growth rate of about 3.8% to 2030. In the V scenario, and the as you see, the 2020 growth is our growth forecast taken from the IMF is the same for 2020, but it differs for 2021, 2022, 2023. Average growth rates for 2020 is minus 2.4 for Africa, but then the averages differ out till 2030, 3.2, 2.9, 2.6%, while the average for the rest of the world is a growth rate of about 1.6%. So this economic impact, as I previously indicated, in actual fact is larger than the mortality or the mortality impact by a large margin. This in actual fact drives the impact that COVID is going to have in Africa. Just to give you an idea, this is a graph that shows what would happen with extreme poverty in Africa using $1.90. On the left-hand side is extreme poverty in millions of people, and on the right-hand side is exactly the same, but in percent of people. And what you can see here is that we were expecting that extreme poverty in Africa, because we have an extremely large population, would continue to increase. That's the dotted black line, but that the percent of extremely poor Africans, the right-hand graph, would come down modestly. Now what is going to happen is that not only is the extreme poverty numbers in Africa are going to increase, but even the percentages are not going to come down. So at the bottom, it says that in 2019, there are about 469 million extremely poor Africans, or about 36%. We were expecting on the pre-COVID forecast, the dotted black line, that by 2030 it would be about 570 million Africans, but the rate would have come down to 33%, which is the right-hand graph. But now what's going to happen is that the percentage is in actual fact, and the absolute number is probably going to increase over time. This, of course, is exceptionally bad news for the continent. So this is kind of an example of the impact that that COVID is going to have going forward.
Mm. Thank you very much for that explanation, Jakkie. In your study, you mentioned the lockdown strategy pursued by many African states in connection with COVID-19. And it seems to me that that strategy was modeled on countries like China that have much greater resources than African countries. How effective has been this strategy? That's one question that I'd like you to address. And a corollary to that question is, what does the future look like for Africa if a vaccine is not found quickly and available extensively throughout the continent?
You know, when COVID came, when it burst onto the international scene, Africa, in a sense, did not know how to react, and we didn't really have accurate information. So we generally copied what the rest of the world was doing. We therefore closed borders, tried to so-called flatten the curve, but there was very little curve to flatten, because the reality is that COVID is only now coming to Africa. So it gave us time. I think that generally African governments reacted with imperfect data and information, but in a sense tried their best. I think we would probably all agree that the idea that of individual isolation and lockdown really can't work in much of Africa. In certain countries, to a degree, it can work. But it really, in my view, is a way to get people to accept how serious the situation is and to change behavior. And I think that that's really the message that was being sent. Only now, I'm in South Africa. I mean, COVID is becoming a real epidemic in South Africa now, both in Cape Town and in Gauteng and in Johannesburg and Pretoria. So I think that maybe let me, I've showed you what's going to happen with poverty rates. If we want to understand what the long-term impact of COVID is going to be, it is going to be huge. This is a graph that shows what's going to happen on GDP per capita in Africa. Now there's a dotted black line, which is our growth forecast for Africa out till 2030, the top black dotted line out till 2030. And then there is the blue line, which is the V-shaped economic recovery, the U-shaped and the L-shaped. Each of them have got different mortality assumptions associated with them, and each one of them have got different social grants associated with them. But there's a dashed line which indicates that even under the best case, the V-shaped scenario, Africa only recovers to the 2019 average GDP per capita in 2024. Our most likely, which is the U-shaped scenario, means that Africa recovers at about 2027. And in the L-shaped scenario, Africa only gets back to the 2019 average rates of GDP per capita in 2030. What does this imply? It implies that things are going to get significantly worse before they become better. It implies that people are going to become desperate, that governments have less capacity because their revenues go down, and that in actual fact, we are going to see, I would suspect, not only that Africa loses, 6 to 10 years of development in the process, but that we are going to see significantly a larger degree of instability on the continent going forward. And this is not a good news story. COVID has devastating consequences on the continent. So yeah, that sort of illustrates the challenges that I think we face.
Thank you, Jakkie. I believe you were to share with us that graphic, but you didn't share the screen. But it's actually better because of my next question, which is directly connected with that. Meaning, in your comparative outcomes of the proposed scenarios, the V, the U, and the L shapes, exactly that. It seems clear the longer the impact of the pandemic, the worse the impact on the development goals. Could you elaborate a bit on the impact comparison vis-a-vis early measures that may or may not be taken about now?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't share the screen. So this was the graph that I was referring to, which shows the various interventions. And if I were to summarize the impact, this is a table that summarizes the impact of COVID in Africa. On the left-hand side so if we compare the impact of COVID with what would have been Africa's trajectory last year when we looked at growth until 2030, this year we expect an additional 14 million Africans to fall into extreme poverty. And by 2030, the number would be 37 million in the V-shaped scenario. And then you can see in the U and the L-shaped scenario, in the worst case L-shaped scenario, by 2030, 70 million more Africans are in extreme poverty than would otherwise be the case. The second column is income per capita, shows that this year average GDP per capita is going to fall by $316. And it could be anything between $299 to $535. There are the assumptions that we put in the model that comes from the Imperial College data on mortality. Now, Africa at the moment has a population of 1.3 billion. By 2030, Africa has about 1.7 billion. So even a mortality in the worst case of 1.6 million, it is, of course, huge, but it is really not significant. And that is because we have a much younger population. If you were to look at many of those people will not die because of COVID, but they will die because reductions in health expenditure. So African governments are going to have much lower revenues. They will not be able to spend the same amount on malaria prevention, on combating HIV/AIDS and other diseases. So health expenditure will go down, and that means that over time, people are going to die from other causes than from COVID, because our forecast is that, in the V-shaped scenario, you get a vaccine maybe end of this year and it's rolled out. In the U-shaped scenario, you get a vaccine next year and it's rolled out. In the L-shaped scenario, you get a scenario in 2022 and it's rolled out. Or you learn to live with COVID. But if you look on the right-hand side, this is the difference in economic activity in billion 2019 US dollars. So Africa this year alone, we expect, is going to lose $202 billion in economic activity. That is huge. By 2030, in the worst case scenario, it's more than $500 billion. I mean, the COVID is unprecedented in terms of its impact, unless what we see is a huge global rebound, because 80–90% of this impact comes from government measures to try and respond to that impact. So I say again, the impact of this is going to be quite devastating in many senses.
Well, that's very, very sobering indeed. So, Jakkie, if I could shift the conversation a little bit to post-lockdown. Some countries are adopting so-called risk-adjusted post-lockdown strategies. How successful have they been thus far?
I think that Africans, as I indicated before, the impact, the infection and mortality impact is only now coming to Africa, and I think the effects have been quite minimal. The impact of government measures, given the reality of our informal economies, is I think questionable. So I don't blame African governments. We are copying what happened elsewhere in the world, but I don't believe that it is a significant. We have to find a different way of dealing with COVID, and that is that's all around changing of behavior, education, and in a sense, community responsibility, I think, of responding to COVID.
And associated with that, Jakkie, do you think that a crisis, a human development crisis, can be averted in Africa?
I think as I've tried to indicate with a slide that's still up there, the impact of COVID is huge, COVID is, we are lucky because what we have in Africa is a much more youthful population. The median age in Africa is about 19, and that means that our mortality rates and also the impact of the infection is quite low. But the reality is, even with low mortality rates, and even if the infection does not impact upon labor productivity, I don't see how Africa can deal with this without significant international support and engagement. And I think what we're going to see is, for the next few years, we're going to see that once again, Africa is going to require debt assistance, forgiveness, and the help of the international community. But there are also other things that can be done.
Thank you, Jakkie. Actually, it's some of those other things that can be done that we should probably also address, because in this study you do point out at least 4 key policy recommendations. precisely on that: health, basic infrastructure, and economic transformation. But on your book, Africa First, you address several other factors for growth and transformation. Among these later in your book, which would be the key 3 or 4 also for the next 10 to 20 years?
So these are, I hope you can still see my screen.
I'm afraid not.
Okay. Let me just show you that again. These are the recommendations that come from our COVID study. So there are 4. We saying firstly, I think that given the high levels of debt of key countries, including South Africa, Angola, and others, we are going to see an emerging debt crisis that require a moratorium and likely some debt forgiveness. Africa needs to improve and increase health spending. 41 countries have experienced a pandemic in the last decade, yet Africa generally spends below global averages. But how do you do that at a time when your government revenues are really going to decline? Third is we need to invest in basic infrastructure, water, sanitation, the typical wash infrastructure, which we have not invested in over many years. And then the final point really is about the need for greater efforts towards the economic transformation of Africa. And this is where the book that I did, Africa First, really comes in. Now, what Africa First does is it examines the history and the current path forecast for Africa. And then I model 11 scenarios to explore the impact of each towards improved livelihoods, and also look at climate change and jobs. And I look at the combined impact. But those 11 scenarios are really based on what can be done to change this picture. And this is a picture of average GDP, average incomes in Africa, which is the bottom green line, compared to average incomes in the rest of the world. And it looks out till 2040. The essential story, it's clear. Look at the growing gap between average incomes in Africa and average incomes in the rest of the world. In 1990, average incomes in Africa were 45% of that in the rest of the world. It's now about 27%. And our forecast is that by 2040, it's going to be about 23%. And this is despite the fact that Africa grows at that point, when I wrote the book, was going to grow at about 4.6% average out till 2040. We are not closing the gap. So what Africa First does is I take 11 interventions and I model the impact of each of them on the future of Africa. So they are, what is the impact of a demographic dividend, of improving basic infrastructure, improvements in education, agriculture, social grants, industrialization, leapfrogging, the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, greater peace, stability, better governance, and then foreign assistance. And I look at these interventions as what can that do to the future of Africa. So drawing from that, I think what the COVID study does is that we really need to accelerate the transformation of Africa to much, much more rapid rates of economic growth if we are going to recover from the impact of COVID.
Jakkie, keeping with the theme of the demographic dividend, very interesting aspect of your book. The basic premise seems to me that young population in Africa could create a faster economic growth. But that is not what we see in most of the continent. Where we see is that, they could be a big social time bomb, in fact, just around the corner, due to social and economic fragilities that African countries face. Can you elaborate a bit more on these challenges and constraints?
Yes, so I'm not an economist, but economists have told me that there are three contributors to economic growth: labor, capital, and technology, and that these three give you economic growth. Now, what is our major advantage in Africa? It's our people. We have a large growing population. That's what we tell ourselves and we tell everybody. So we use the notion of a demographic dividend. But what exactly is a demographic dividend? Demographic dividend is the ratio of working age people, 15 to 65, to dependents, children and elderly. So it's that middle block. If that ratio is about 1.7 and larger, 1.7 working age people to every dependent, you get into a sweet spot where economically you grow. And that actual fact at low levels of development explains 1/3 to a half of long-term economic growth. So if you're a poor country, in a sense, it makes sense. If you're a poor country, you have labor. And if you have a large labor force, they push up your economic growth rates. But the problem is that we have such a young population that we only get to that demographic dividend beyond the middle of the century. So here is a bit of a complicated graph, but here I look at Angola. Most of you know Angola or expats from Angola. That looks from 1960 until the end of the century at the ratio of working age people to dependents for Angola, which is the dotted black line, and for low income Africa, low middle income Africa, and upper middle income Africa, and compares that with East Asia. Now look at two things. Firstly, look at the fact that East Asia, China, the Asian tigers, peaked at about 2.8 working age people per dependent. And that explains 1/3 to half of the economic growth rates. Look at the low levels at which Africa is going to peak. And then look at Angola. Angola only enters its demographic sweet spot in 2063. This is huge. We have such a young population that it will take us 4 decades to that young population translates into a labor force that helps with productivity. So in Africa First, I model a scenario where we improve, where we roll out better access to modern contraceptives, we improve basic health care, and we empower women. And the result is this. So the black line is Angola, the dotted black line is the current path. And you can see that Angola enters its demographic dividend 13 years earlier. It peaks at a much higher rate. So that translates into more rapid economic growth. But, by 2050, the world is a different place. And will labor still make that contribution to growth? I doubt that. I think technology and capital is much more important. So, sorry, a long answer to a very simple question. But this demographics is in actual fact something that is not in many African countries actually is a constraint on our development. Not a popular thing to say, but that's how I see it.
Right. And the other issue, of course, is that much of the young population do not necessarily have access to the type of education that will enable them to be qualified members of that labor pool even by 2050. What are some of the things that African governments like Angola can do to ensure that the labor force will be a qualified labor force by the year 2050?
And there are many answers to that. And the obvious ones relate to the importance of investing in education and making sure that our populations are adequately fed. But what has often happened in Africa is that you fix education from the bottom upward. So you first do your literacy, then primary, then lower secondary, then upper secondary, then tertiary education, and you invest in vocational education. Now, many African countries are waking up to this now, but the reality is we haven't done that. We often try and build a tertiary educational system when the feeding stock is not available. So there is no, maybe the most important thing that I learned from writing Africa First is that there's no shortcut. We are always looking, if you are, the countries in the Middle East that is on a sea of oil, maybe you had a transition, but you need to do the basics. You need to build basic infrastructure. You need to feed your people. You need to push them through through all the traditional steps of development, and that's what we generally are often not doing in much of Africa.
Thank you, Jakkie. I know you just said that there are no shortcuts, but I cannot resist, especially because of the approach we're having on demographic dividend, and on the other hand, also the need for industrialization in the continent. To note that the COVID-19 impact on the supply chain dynamics was international, international dynamics, and certain countries and sectors can in fact be more impacted than others. And I'm obviously thinking about those who currently use more the international supply chain. Over the long term, do you think that the African countries could actually benefit from shifting supply chains and having more African-made products?
Oh yes, very definitely. I mean, in our studies, when I do these compare the impact of the different scenarios. Okay, it depends if you're a lower middle, upper middle income country, what gives the most growth, if I can put it this way. But as we see the disruption of global value chains, and we see what some refer to as the reshoring of value chains, but also manufacturing moving closer to the consumer, to the market, I think Africa can benefit from this. There are many that tell you that China is, and East Asia is now the factory of the world. But I think that there is still opportunity, particularly if we can get the African Continental Free Trade Area going, and we can start manufacturing, import substitution, but I don't mean it start making basic things. Bottled water and toothpicks and I don't know what else that we need for our own development, because as you would know, trade with your neighboring countries invariably has a higher value added component than trade with others, and it's one of the most important reasons why we need to get the African Continental Free Trade Area going. If we don't get the African Continental Free Trade Area going, we will not grow. We don't have sufficiently large internal markets. So and I'm hoping that that COVID will in actual fact reinvigorate, will invigorate the movement towards the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area and all those benefits. There are reasons why China, the US, and Europe develop more rapidly. They have larger markets. And we need that, but we also need to change the productive structures of African economies. We consume. We need to produce. If we don't produce, we will never get anywhere. And we can try a services-led growth path. That's what India is doing. But the result of India is slow growth. In my view, I'm maybe a traditionalist in the sense you need to make things. You need to go up that manufacturing value curve, maybe through the agro-processing route. I don't know, but those are very important. So I think that there is potential for Africa still to occupy a space in what's happening with global value chains. We are not part of global value chains at the moment. We first need to build national and regional value chains, and then we can perhaps become part of international value chains.
Jakkie, I want to bring you back to some of the things that we've been touching on tangentially, and this is something that you are one of the foremost experts on in Africa security. We're talking about COVID, we're talking about all of these issues, the demographic dividend, and so on and so forth. How will all of this impact on the security in Africa at two levels? At the level of the individual and at the level of the states?
So one of the reasons why there is a very close correlation, as you would know, between GDP per capita or a country's wealth and security. The richer a country is, the more stable it is. That's why Africa, which is the poorest region globally, is unstable. Partly, how do we think about that? Because governments have less capacity. They don't have the ability to provide security across the country, to police their rural areas and their borders. What COVID is going to do, it is going to significantly undermine the ability of African governments to provide security. It doesn't matter if it's a democratic or an undemocratic country. The sheer ability to provide means to provide greater security is going to decline. So I am quite worried that not only in Africa but elsewhere, what we will see accompanying COVID is particularly a rise in protests and anti-government unhappiness. We already see that, I think. People are going to get hungry, angry, and they're going to blame their governments. And if you are an autocratic government, you will probably use this to become more autocratic. Hopefully, it will also lead to greater accountability in those countries that are emerging democracies, and there are many in Africa. But I'm very concerned about the fact that what we will see through the impact of COVID is a contraction of the ability of government to provide, and that we will therefore see, with a large youth bulge, more protest and instability on the continent. That's why it is hugely incumbent upon us and upon African governments to really pull those levers that can accelerate growth. And those levers are the implementation of continental free trade area. It is leapfrogging using modern technology, and these kind of interventions that can change the productive structures of African economies. So I think in general that protest movements are going to become the next big thing after terrorism. Terrorism will remain with it, but in a sense we've learned to live with it, and there are a number of African states in the Sahel that are going to struggle. We did a big study on the future of the Sahel, and if you look at Niger, Mali, Central African Republic, and so on and so forth, these are countries that already are embroiled in violence and instability, and with government capacity declining, and the impact of climate change in that region, we're facing serious challenges going ahead. And I hope that will focus the attention of leadership and others in Africa.
If I may add just one tiny thing, going slightly back, it is obvious by what you just told us, but also from your book, that high value added commodities, that is to say manufacturing, is highly dependent obviously on education development.
Yeah.
But the fact that in Africa we do have a large population without still, hopefully in the near future, still that level of even vocational education, the current opportunity in the supply chain trends internationally could still be harnessed by this large capacity of our demographics to do a more basic, let's put it this way, manufacturing development.
Yes, I believe so. I think the consumer market is growing, the demand is growing, and the trend is, and of course the fourth industrial revolution, digitization, whatever you want to call it, means that the input cost required for manufacturing, for example, is declining. And through renewables and all these transitions, you can now do things that were virtually impossible. You can literally leapfrog. And we have all used the example of M-Pesa and so on in East Africa banking. And now what I found quite surprising is that one of the advantages of digitization is that you can more rapidly bring the informal sector into you can slowly but gradually formalize the informal sector. By lowering barriers to entry and by leapfrogging and all of these things mean a lot in Africa. But I think that the other problem that we face in Africa is that we have generally weak states and often poor governance, and that in today's world we need a partnership. We need to unlock the private sector in Africa. We need to find a way of using digitization and the new global economy to be able to provide service delivery in extremely poor environments. And that is possible. And that's another way. I mean, if one thinks in Luanda, I think if I'm right, the largest business in the informal sector is the provision of water. That's what I learned. And there are ways that can be monetized, and there's ways in which that can be brought into the formal sector. So there's a long road ahead, but modern technology, digitization, and can provide a huge means, but it comes with dangers, because the other thing that is characteristic of Africa is that we are democratizing quite rapidly. And this sounds like strange, but it is true. If you look at levels of GDP per capita and education, then Africa is more democratic than you would expect. There are many reasons for this: donor pressure and all kinds of stuff. But it's also because African people have had the experience of autocracy since the 1960s. They demand a different level of accountability. And democratizing while developing is much more difficult than developing and then democratizing, which is what happened in Asia. So our developmental path going forward is a difficult pathway, no doubt about that.
Okay, I believe our moderators has ran out of questions, but let me tell you that was very, very excellent conversation with Jakkie Cilliers. Many fruitful insights that he gave. From this, we can conclude that African countries still are facing many, many challenges. And to overcome these challenges will be, like Jakkie told us, that we should promote the private sector, we should promote the free trade, we should educate the population, we should also invest in the technology. This will be very, very challenging. We have many difficulties in this COVID-19 is becoming a kind of hurdle that we have to overcome and to target these goals. Many thanks, Jakkie, for this your very fruitful insights, and we counting on you on the next ones. For sure, we'll have to invite you. Many thanks for the moderators, Assis and Miguel. Very good questions that you addressed to Jakkie, and many thanks for the participants as well that also enrich our webinar. We're counting on you next month. We'll let you know about the next conference. And thank you very much to all of you. Thanks.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for allowing me to talk at length.
Thank you, Jakkie.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.